Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are diving straight into what I like to call the illusion of money. We'll be looking at how banks actually create it, a pretty shocking corporate true crime scandal, and finally, a completely different ethical financial framework. So, to kick things off, I want you to think about a super basic, everyday action. Consider what actually happens to your paycheck once you deposit it. It's just sitting there in your checking account, right? You open your app, you check the balance, and it kind of feels like your money is just resting safely in a digital vault, just waiting for you. But, well, the reality of what's happening behind the scenes is far more active than that. In fact, it's literally the absolute engine of modern finance. How exactly do banks make money from your money?
That engine is what we call fractional reserve banking. It's a practice where banks maintain only a portion of customer deposits in reserve, lending the rest out to create a multiplier effect. Basically, banks only hold a tiny fraction of your funds in their actual reserves, just enough to cover everyday withdrawals. The rest of your money, the bank actually takes it and uses it to make investments or issue loans to other customers. And when those borrowers spend that money, it gets deposited back into other banks, which then hold a fraction and lend the rest out again. If you follow this chain, it creates a massive multiplier effect. Your single deposit is actually helping finance multiple loans all across the economy. Crazy, right?
Now, early economists immediately recognized the sheer power of this system. Back in 1911, Joseph Schumpeter pointed out that banks aren't just acting as passive middlemen. They aren't simply moving existing money from a saver over to a borrower. Because of this multiplier effect, Schumpeter noted that banks are essentially creating commodities. As his famous quote says, they are creating new purchasing power from nothing. Other renowned economists like Ludwig von Mises completely echoed this, describing how banks create unbacked fiduciary media that can literally be spent in the real world. And looking at the academic analysis of financial intermediaries and credit expansion, we see that Western finance broadly accepts the system. The main argument is that financial intermediaries, which is just a fancy term for banks, provide essential liquidity. Researchers like Diamond and Divig pointed out that, well, depositors absolutely hate uncertainty. We want access to our money quickly, right? Meanwhile, borrowers need long-term loans. Banks essentially bridge this gap. Plus, they reduce what's called information asymmetry. That just means they take on the really costly, tedious work of figuring out which borrowers are actually trustworthy, saving the rest of us from having to do all that homework. So here is the Western banking justification in a nutshell. It enables massive credit expansion, supports new investments, enhances systemic liquidity, and overcomes market failures and information gaps. Western economics views this cycle of lending and debt as a perfectly sound, highly efficient mechanism. The general consensus is that the risk of lending out money that technically belongs to depositors is entirely worth the immense macroeconomic growth it generates for all of us. But let's step out of the ivory tower of economic theory for just a second here. What happens when the pressure to maximize these mechanics creates a toxic, fraudulent culture? What actually occurs when the drive for this constant credit expansion becomes totally unchecked? Basically, what happens when a bank realizes that the more financial products it pushes on its customers, the more it feeds this massive engine of profitability until a demand for growth completely overrides basic ethics? Well, that exact scenario brings us to the Wells Fargo scandal and a concept called cross-selling. Cross-selling is simply the practice of attempting to sell multiple products, like credit cards or mortgages, to an existing customer. So if you have a checking account, a banker will heavily encourage you to also take out a mortgage or a credit card or set up online banking. The former CEO of Wells Fargo, Richard Kovacevic, championed this approach hard. He actually viewed his branch employees purely as salespeople, and regular citizens not as clients, but simply as consumers. Let's see how this immense pressure builds into an actual crisis. The bank initiated a top-down sales quota known as Going for Great, spelled GR-EIGHT, demanding that branch employees sell at least 8 financial products to every single customer. But here's the catch. According to reports, these quotas were completely mathematically impossible to achieve legitimately. So faced with these totally unreachable goals, employees resorted to a fraudulent reality. A super common tactic they used was known as pinning. Bankers would secretly set a customer's PIN to 0000. This allowed the employee to covertly control the client's account and enroll them in extra programs, like online banking, without the customer ever consenting or honestly even knowing about it. And the human cost of this was absolutely staggering. We're talking panic attacks, frequent vomiting, and even drinking hand sanitizer to cope with impossible sales pressure. This wasn't just a simple paperwork error, it was a brutal pressure cooker culture. The information asymmetry and moral hazard took a massive toll on branch-level workers. And if workers tried to do the right thing and call the company's ethics hotline to report the fraud, many were simply ignored or instantly fired, sometimes with defamatory records that actually prevented them from ever getting a banking job again. The sheer scale of this deception is honestly almost hard to comprehend. 3.5 million. That is the estimated number of fraudulent, unauthorized checking, savings, and credit card accounts that were opened in the names of everyday customers who had absolutely no idea it was happening. Some of these customers were even charged fees on accounts they never asked for, actively damaging their credit scores in the process. And compounding that massive scale is this figure, 5,300. That's the number of Wells Fargo employees who were fired over a multi-year period as a result of these fraudulent sales practices. Initially, the bank's leadership actually tried to blame the problem entirely on these lower-level employees. They claimed it was just an issue with isolated bad apples, rather than an intentional systemic corporate strategy. But, as you can imagine, regulators didn't buy that defense forever. Ultimately, the fallout culminated in this staggering number, $3 billion. That represents the combined fines levied by the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and other regulators to address the bank's criminal and civil violations. It really was the slow burn of a mega scandal. Back in 2013, the LA Times first exposed the pressure cooker sales culture. But it wasn't until September 2016 that the CFPB levied an initial $185 million fine, which triggered national outrage and the eventual resignation of CEO John Stumpf. Fast forward to December 2018, all 50 state attorneys general settled for $575 million, leading finally to those massive $3 billion DOJ and SEC fines in February 2020. It is a textbook case of what economists call moral hazard, where the incentives for aggressive credit expansion completely detach from any sort of ethical accountability. So, seeing the incredible damage that the system of aggressive, artificial credit creation and unchecked moral hazard can cause, we really have to ask, is there a financial framework that fundamentally rejects this system of artificial credit and moral hazard? Is there an alternative out there that fundamentally rejects the very premise of fractional reserve banking? To answer that, we're drawing directly from the academic literature, specifically a comparative analysis of economic perspectives from the journal Economic Islam. This research introduces Islamic finance, which actually poses a profound philosophical challenge to the Western fractional reserve system we've been talking about. It's not just about, changing interest rates. It's about fundamentally rethinking what money actually is and how a bank should even be allowed to use it. Just look at the direct comparison between the Western perspective and the Islamic perspective. The Western approach actively relies on creating fiduciary media, substitute money created out of debt, to drive credit expansion, even if it ends up causing artificial inflation. The Islamic perspective, on the other hand, challenges the very legitimacy of creating money out of nothing. It's strictly governed by the prohibition of riba, which means interest, and the avoidance of gharar, which translates to uncertainty or excessive risk. Simply put, a system that lends out money it doesn't actually have and then charges interest on it violates both of these core tenets. This brings us to the specific Islamic critique of fractional reserves. First, scholars argue that it creates an impossible issue of dual ownership in deposit structures. Think about it. If I deposit money and the bank lends that exact same money to someone else, who actually owns it? This directly contradicts the principle of milkiyah, or true ownership. Furthermore, Islamic scholars argue that this system inherently violates justice in financial dealings. By allowing banks to just continuously create money out of debt, it structurally exposes the entire financial system to the exact kind of greed-driven financial crises and moral hazards we just witnessed over at Wells Fargo. We've looked at the incredibly powerful engine of Western banking, the pretty devastating real-world consequences when its incentives run completely amok, and a deeply rooted alternative framework that demands absolute ethical clarity over endless credit expansion. So, as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a lingering thought to chew on next time you swipe your debit card. In our modern economy, where exactly is the line between aggressive financial innovation and the ethical protection of your money? Think about it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you in the next one.